It was the morning of November 2008 when the world of 13-month-old Amora Carson came to an abrupt and tragic end. Inside a modest apartment in Kilgore, Texas, Amora's life was violently cut short during what her mother and her mother's boyfriend, Blaine Milam, later described as an exorcism, an act of horrific violence disguised as a twisted attempt to rid the child of a supposed demon. Amora's body showed the brutal marks of the attack, a combination of skull fractures, broken ribs, bite marks, and deep bruising, evidence of prolonged physical and sexual abuse. The young girl had endured 30 hours of unimaginable suffering at the hands of those who were supposed to love and protect her. But how did this tragedy unfold? It began with Blaine Milam, a young man just 18 years old, who entered the life of Jesseca Carson, Amora's mother. The two quickly formed a bond, one that would ultimately prove fatal for the child. What appeared to be a seemingly normal relationship between mother and boyfriend soon turned sinister when the couple became obsessed with the idea of cleansing Amora of a demonic presence. The attack started innocently enough, at least, in the eyes of the perpetrators. The young couple began isolating Amora, locking her in a dark room for hours, and subjecting her to brutal physical punishments. The exorcism escalated to a frenzy of violence as Milam and Carson believed the child was possessed. Instead of offering protection and care, they inflicted pain on the helpless infant in an attempt to force out something that wasn't even there. Amora's cries for help went unheard. For hours, she endured agony while her abusers believed they were performing some twisted act of salvation. But salvation never came for the young girl, and by the time authorities arrived at the scene, her life was already lost. The community was shaken to its core, left to grapple with how such a horrific crime could happen in a place that was supposed to be safe. As the police investigation unfolded, the truth about the exorcism was revealed, and the two young perpetrators were quickly arrested. But the real question lingered: what drove two seemingly ordinary people to commit such an atrocious act against an innocent child? Pause for a moment. What would make someone believe that hurting a child was the answer? How do twisted ideologies and beliefs take hold of someone so completely that they commit an act of violence this extreme? What do you think was at the heart of this tragedy? Was it just pure evil, or was there something more? Share your thoughts below. Hit the like button if you believe the world needs to pay more attention to the signs of abuse and the power of mental health in preventing such tragedies. Subscribe to stay updated on the full story of Blaine Milam and Jesseca Carson, and don't forget to turn on notifications for the next part of this chilling case. Blaine Milam and Jesseca Carson were no strangers to hardship. Both in their late teens, they had come from broken homes, each carrying scars of their own, though in different ways. The two of them, both seeking connection and escape, found each other in a small, quiet corner of East Texas. But their union, which seemed to hold the promise of something better, would take a dark turn, one that would devastate a child and leave a community reeling. Blaine Milam, only 18 when he entered into his relationship with Jesseca, had been no stranger to violence. Raised in a turbulent household, Milam had spent his adolescence moving in and out of trouble. With a history of petty offenses and a growing disconnect from societal norms, he was a troubled young man searching for belonging. What he found instead was a volatile relationship with Jesseca, a young mother who was struggling to keep her life together. Jesseca, too, had her own demons. She had given birth to Amora when she was just 17 years old, and her life as a young mother was full of challenges. The strain of single motherhood weighed heavily on her, but she found solace in her relationship with Milam. He became not only her partner but someone who could fill the emotional void left by her difficult upbringing. Together, they seemed to form a bond that, on the surface, was like any other young couple in love, but behind closed doors, the cracks began to form. Their relationship quickly spiraled into a mix of unhealthy dependency and psychological manipulation. Blaine Milam, who had begun dabbling in dark ideologies, started to believe in supernatural forces. He began to openly discuss the idea of spiritual possession, suggesting that demons and dark entities could inhabit a person's body. It wasn't long before Jesseca, who was already in a fragile state, became swept up in Milam's ideas. The couple's life together became increasingly dominated by these twisted beliefs. But it wasn't just talk. They began isolating Amora, subjecting the child to bizarre rituals that they believed were necessary for her spiritual cleansing. Milam convinced Jesseca that their daughter was possessed, that a demon had taken hold of her body, and that the only way to rid her of it was through an exorcism of their own making. Amora's cries for help fell on deaf ears. No one outside the small apartment knew what was unfolding in the darkness of that home. The abuse escalated over time, with both Milam and Carson taking turns to carry out what they called the exorcism. The violence was senseless, fueled by delusions and misguided beliefs, and there was no one to stop them. Neighbors, who occasionally saw the couple and the child, described them as quiet, but nobody knew the horrors that were happening behind closed doors. The isolation Milam and Carson had created around themselves made it easier for the abuse to continue without anyone intervening. In fact, the only outsiders were the brief moments when Jesseca Carson's own family would come to visit. They saw little, perhaps just the odd comment about the child being difficult or troubled, but never anything that would raise a red flag. But in the silence of that apartment, Blaine and Jessica's twisted reality continued to build. The horrors they were about to unleash on Amora didn't come from nowhere, they were the result of months of manipulation, psychological torment, and a deep descent into belief systems that were not only false but deadly. The stage was set for the most tragic chapter of their relationship. Pause and reflect. How does someone's mind become so consumed by these kinds of beliefs? What makes them feel that something as innocent as a child could be a vessel for evil? Do you think the system failed these individuals? Could someone have noticed the signs before it was too late? Share your thoughts below. Hit the like button if you believe we need to take a closer look at the factors that drive people to commit violence in the name of misguided beliefs. Subscribe to stay updated on this disturbing case, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of the story. The aftermath of Amora Carson's death sent shockwaves through the small community of Kilgore, Texas. When authorities arrived at the apartment, they were met with a scene that would stay with them forever. A tragedy so horrific that even seasoned law enforcement officers struggled to process the brutality that had unfolded in such a seemingly quiet home. Blaine Milam and Jesseca Carson, still in their late teens, were arrested and charged with capital murder for their involvement in the abuse and death of young Amora. As the investigation unfolded, the chilling details began to surface. The idea of an exorcism, that Milam and Carson had so twistedly concocted to justify their actions, was met with disbelief. Investigators were horrified not only by the extent of the physical injuries Amora had suffered but by the calculated nature of the crime, carried out by two people who seemed to have become completely disconnected from reality. During questioning, both Milam and Carson gave conflicting accounts of what had happened. Milam's story was more chilling than anyone could have anticipated. He spoke of his belief that Amora was possessed, describing the violent acts he had carried out in the name of saving her. Carson, for her part, claimed she had been influenced by Milam, although the evidence against her was just as damning. She had allowed the abuse to happen, participated in the violence, and, according to the investigation, stood by as Amora's suffering escalated. What stood out most in the investigation was the lack of remorse from both individuals. As they were confronted with the brutal reality of Amora's injuries, their answers remained disturbingly detached. The case was a stark reminder of how dangerous unchecked beliefs and isolation could be, how, in the midst of delusion, two young people could subject a helpless child to the most unimaginable horrors. The forensic evidence painted an even more horrific picture. Amora's body had been subjected to unimaginable abuse over the course of the 30 hours. Her injuries included fractures to her skull, broken ribs, and deep, unmistakable signs of neglect. The evidence also showed bite marks, bruising, and lacerations that suggested not only physical violence but a complete disregard for her well-being as a human being. There was no way to escape the brutal truth: Amora had been tortured by those she should have trusted most. For the community, the realization that such a tragedy could happen in their midst was nearly impossible to bear. The once peaceful, tight-knit town was forced to confront the harsh reality that someone had allowed, and even participated in, such cruelty. People began to ask themselves, how could anyone allow something like this to happen? And even more chilling, what had been happening behind closed doors that no one had noticed. As the legal proceedings moved forward, both Milam and Carson faced mounting charges. The case became a national point of discussion. People wanted answers. They wanted to know how such a senseless act of violence could be so easily justified in the minds of those involved. Could mental illness have been a factor? Were there warning signs that had gone unnoticed? As the trial began, these questions loomed large. Pause and reflect. What do you think was the root cause of the crime? Was it the result of a toxic relationship, mental illness, or something else entirely? What kind of safeguards should we have in place to prevent tragedies like this? How can we protect vulnerable children from harm when the very people meant to protect them are the ones causing the pain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and hit the like button if you think more needs to be done to protect children from the horrors of abuse. Subscribe to stay updated as we continue to follow this heartbreaking case and its devastating consequences. The courtroom was filled with tension. The trial of Blaine Milam and Jesseca Carson was unlike any other that had come before it. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with the young age of the perpetrators, had captured the nation's attention. As the trial began, the full scope of Amora's suffering came to light, each day revealing more about the horrors that had taken place behind the closed doors of that Texas apartment. Milam's defense team tried to argue that he had acted under the influence of mental illness, suggesting that his belief in demonic possession had distorted his perception of reality. They painted a picture of a troubled young man who had been shaped by a lifetime of neglect and a warped sense of spirituality. But this argument didn't sit well with the jury, who had seen the cold indifference with which Milam carried out his attack. The images of Amora's battered body, the bite marks, the fractures, and bruises, they told a story that no defense could counter. Jesseca Carson's defense was also based on her own struggles, claiming she was a victim of manipulation by Milam. She had been portrayed as a passive participant, someone who was easily led into this tragedy. But again, the evidence was damning. She hadn't stopped Milam. She hadn't protected her daughter. Instead, she had stood by and watched as Amora's life was slowly extinguished. Carson's role in the crime was clear: she had been complicit, allowing the abuse to escalate and ultimately turning a blind eye to the suffering of her own child. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll became evident. The victims' families sat in the courtroom, their faces etched with grief, as the details of their loved ones' final hours were laid bare. It was almost unbearable to hear the descriptions of Amora's injuries, the fear that must have consumed her as she endured 30 hours of torment. But through the pain, the family members were resolute. They demanded justice, not only for Amora but for all children who might be suffering in silence, unseen and unheard. The defense tried to paint the picture of two teenagers who had fallen victim to their circumstances, but the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was overwhelming. In the end, it wasn't about their age or their past, it was about what they had done. Milam and Carson had taken a life. They had stolen the innocence of a young girl who had no chance to defend herself. As the jury deliberated, the weight of the crime loomed large. The decision they would soon make would have a profound impact on Milam and Carson's future, but it also represented something much larger: the need for society to address issues of abuse, mental illness, and the consequences of failing to protect the most vulnerable. Pause and reflect. Do you think the defense arguments about mental illness and manipulation were valid? Or do you believe that the crime was simply an act of cruelty that could never be justified, no matter the circumstances? What do you think the legal system should do to address the responsibility of young offenders who commit such horrific acts? Can they ever be truly rehabilitated, or should they face the full consequences of their actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and hit the like button if you believe the justice system needs to take a hard look at how it handles cases like this, especially when it involves the abuse of children. Subscribe to stay updated as the trial comes to a close and the verdict is announced. The evening of September 25, 2025, was heavy with anticipation and sorrow. In the heart of Huntsville, Texas, the state's penitentiary stood as a solemn witness to the culmination of a case that had gripped the nation. Blaine Milam, convicted of the brutal 2008 murder of his girlfriend's 13-month-old daughter, Amora Carson, was scheduled for execution. Milam's crime had been one of the most heinous in recent memory. Over a harrowing 30-hour period, he and his then-girlfriend, Jesseca Carson, subjected the innocent child to unimaginable abuse, claiming it was an exorcism to rid her of a supposed demon. The child's body bore the marks of their cruelty, multiple skull fractures, broken bones, bite marks, and signs of strangulation. The brutality of the act left the community and the nation in shock. As the day of his execution approached, Milam's legal team made one final attempt to halt the proceedings, citing claims of intellectual disability and challenging the forensic evidence used in his conviction. However, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his appeal, and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously rejected his request for clemency. At 6:19 p.m., Milam was escorted to the death chamber. The room was filled with a tense silence as the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, at 6:40 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Milam's final statement was delivered from the gurney, his voice calm and unwavering. He expressed gratitude to those who had supported him during his time on death row and thanked the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Chaplaincy for providing faith-based programs. He then implored those present to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, saying, "If any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you no matter who you are to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and we will meet again. I love you all. Bring me home." His last meal request was modest: a cheeseburger, oven-fried potatoes, green beans, pinto beans, sliced bread, scrambled eggs, country gravy, a sausage patty, pears, biscuits, tea, and water. This meal was provided to him earlier in the day, as is customary in Texas. The execution was carried out swiftly, but the questions it raised lingered. Was justice truly served? Did the death of Blaine Milam bring closure to the tragedy that had befallen Amora Carson? The answers remain complex, as the case continues to provoke debate about the death penalty, the reliability of forensic evidence, and the capacity for redemption. In the aftermath, Rusk County District Attorney Michael Jimerson, who had witnessed the execution, reflected on the profound loss. "We will never know what Amora would have contributed to our world," he said. Answering the call for justice for the most helpless is a measure of a civilized people. As the community of Kilgore and the nation grappled with the events, the story of Amora Carson serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities of children and the need for vigilance and compassion in protecting them. Pause and reflect: was the execution of Blaine Milam the right course of action? Could there have been another way to address the crime and its aftermath? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you believe in the importance of justice and the protection of the most vulnerable among us. Subscribe to stay updated on future stories that delve into complex legal and moral questions.